It's evident that he cares. What do you care about? Welcome to the Rock Newman Show. It's the Rock Newman Show.
Greetings. My name is Dr. Anthony Dixon. I am a public historian and former history professor. I began my education career at Florida A&M University, where I received a BS in history with a minor in African American studies. I then returned to Florida A&M after a few years and received my master's in applied social science with a concentration in history. From FAMU, I went on to Indiana University and received my PhD in history with the major field of African diaspora history, minor field African history, and outside minor library science, special collections, and archives. In this education matriculation, I then started my career in being interested not only in just the history of Black people, but also the material culture and who is controlling and keeping our history. And so I was a professor as well as an archivist at various African American museums. I then also became the university archivist and a history professor at Bethune-Cookman University for approximately 5 years. Now, for those who are interested in this term or these people that we call Black Indians, you first have to understand that it is a complex relationship because you have indigenous blacks here in America who have lineage that goes back and mixes with what we call Native Americans today. And so the term Black Indian has been looked at from a broad perspective, but the dynamics are a little more complicated than that. You have blacks that do have lineage, but that lineage and how they are viewed within Native American culture relies on their matrilineal line, because the matrilineal line indicates whether or not you belong to a clan. And for Native American culture, that is the basis of your existence within the community. And so you have blacks who have Native American fathers, so they have Native American heritage, but they are in a different type of standing. Then, of course, sadly enough, you do have blacks who were enslaved by various Native American groups. Now, the dynamics of that relationship we find in some of those tribes are different and vastly different from what we think of enslavement with the English and with white Americans. And so you have to understand that the dynamics were fluid. There was no linear line in terms of what we say a black Indian is. We simply have collectively called them that for the ease and understanding, so to speak. But you really should get into understanding the rules and the ideologies that Native American tribes as well as blacks had during the various periods. And so when you look, and I give you a good example, when you look at how the relationship deteriorated, it deteriorated when those ideas of the quote unquote blacks who were enslaved, ideologies of white enslavement began to permeate Native American tribes. But then specifically when we get out west and we look at the history of Native Americans out west, something occurs there. What occurs is when Native Americans began to start getting land from the U.S. government, we have some unscrupulous whites who began to pay to get on the Indian roll and get identified as Native American so that they could take part in those land allotments. And so they were paying, and the normal rate was $5. And so the term has been coined $5 Indians. These are actually whites who have no lineage in Native American or black indigenous heritage, yet they are listed as Native Americans simply because they paid some white to get on the roll. And when they did that, they brought those negative connotations on black people, and it started to cause an even further divide between blacks and Native Americans. And so that relationship, and there are different dynamics of what happened with different histories of the different tribes between blacks and natives. But the fact remains that they were driven apart, and there was a wider wedge driven between blacks and natives, and these $5 Indians had a large part to do with that, especially when you start looking at the time period of the late 1800s going forward. And so I want you to do your own research, though. Start with the book Black Indians by Katz. I said start. It's not the end all be all. It is the start. And you understand and you get names and tribes and things of that nature, so that when you do your digging and you do your real research and further research rather, when those names change and you get those original names, you understand the groups of people that we're talking about. And so, again, I encourage you to do your own research. Start with cats, start with Black Indians, but do not stop there. Continue to do research. There's been more and more research since that book, Black Indians. There's been more research done, particularly from Native Americans and Black indigenous people. And that will give you a better understanding of these Black Indians. All right, this time I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about a Florida topic, but it's important in understanding the relationship between Blacks and Native Americans. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss the Seminole Nation and the Seminole Native Americans and their relationship to the Florida Maroons. When we talk about first Florida Maroons, we're talking about individuals who escaped servitude and escaped enslavement from the English colonies, particularly the Carolinas, and created the first Underground Railroad. And that Underground Railroad went southward into what was then called La Florida, which of course was Spanish territory. Now, the makeup of these Maroons, we're now getting more and more information, and we're understanding that they were Gullah people, and these are West Africans and a mixture of West Africans who created their own culture, and they created their own language called Geechee. And so it was a mixture again of West Africans, and then the language was a mixture of West African languages, which included plantation English dialect. And that was the basis of Geechee. Now, there are also indigenous melanated people or indigenous blacks. These are blacks who were in America before Europeans came to America. Now, what we understand is these people were all, and these two groups of blacks were all enslaved in English plantation society. And again, they escaped and they came down into La Florida. Now, when they came into La Florida, they began to create their own communities, and they began to eke out their own existence. And in doing so, we now call them the Florida Maroons. Now, what also happens is, because plantation society begins to encroach upon or begin to take over Native American Indian lands, they are now coming southward into La Florida as well. And so in the late 1600s, the Spanish saw this as an opportunity to weaken plantation society for the English. And so they put out an edict in 1693 and said any enslaved individual that escapes and comes down in La Florida can live free. And so that kind of further established the first Underground Railroad. And so the Native Americans were a homogeneous group of Native Americans that we consider today, and we look at and consider today, but also they included these indigenous blacks. And so when they come down into La Florida, in a short period in the early 1700s, a problem occurs between a larger Native American group to which the English call the Creeks. And they split over the issue of slavery. And so the Northern Creeks pushed their way down into La Florida. And when they mixed with these smaller bands and these smaller tribes, they became this homogeneous group called the Seminoles. And so the Seminoles, who were living as indigenous people, whether they were black or Native American, had their villages. And then you had the blacks, who are the Florida Maroons, who are coming directly from English plantation society. And so what happens is we start seeing a mixture of culture, and they begin in time to intermingle. Now, what we find is the Geechee language develops into a different language, which incorporates Native American words. And so when this happens, we see that the cultural mixture begins to get even deeper. And so as they are trying to fight off the encroachment of the English, as the English began to continue to get land, and they push and get the Spanish to cede over Florida in the early 1800s, all types of dynamics change. Now, within the dynamics, though, it's important to understand that you had rules. Native American culture resided and relied upon the matrilineal line. So if your mother was a Native American, or she was within Native American culture, then the child was considered in Native American culture because they belonged to a clan. And the only way you could belong to a clan is through the matrilineal line. Now, for those who had a father that was Native American, but a mother who was black, whether she was Gullah or simply considered a Florida Maroon, they resided in the Florida Maroon villages. And so in time, we see the Florida Maroons and the Seminole culture, the Native American culture, coming together because they needed each other in order to survive. And there were different aspects, and we can get into that on a different segment. But the key to understanding the difference between the Florida Maroons and the Seminoles that belonged in Seminole society was through that matrilineal line. Now, after the first Seminole War, and there were 3 wars now, but after the first Seminole War, they go into a deeper relationship, and they actually solidified their relationship and put more patterns and more, not really patterns, but more rules and how they would be engaged and how they would survive together. And so at that point, after the first Seminole War, we stopped calling them Florida Maroons, and we simply collectively called them Black Seminoles. But within the Seminole Nation, there was clear distinction. And that clear distinction was based, again, on your matrilineal line and whether or not you belong to a clan. And so names changed, and the English put their names on certain things, and all of this, certain people rather, and all of these different things changed, and you go through freedman and terms like Seminole freedman and Black Seminole. But collectively, once they go out west, they are all called Black Seminoles. And actually, at the end of the first Seminole War, when they go into this formal agreement, we really stopped calling them Florida Maroons and call them collectively Black Seminoles. And so we have to understand that regardless of the different name and name changes and what The government and plantation society call these people as opposed to what they call themselves. When we look at just the people, then we can understand better this relationship. But it is a powerful relationship that we can use to understand the overall quote unquote Native American and black relationship. I want to take just a few minutes to talk about someone who should be far more in the annals of history and studied and actually popularized more than he is. And his name is Osceola. Now, when you think of the wars fought with the U.S. military and Native Americans, you think of Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph. Those names are the more popular and familiar names. But Osceola isn't. Even though the war with the Seminole Nation, the Second Seminole War rather, lasted 7 years, which was the longest, deadliest, and costliest war the government fought. Now, I'll admit, I didn't do much research on Osceola until recently being the last year and a half or so. But I understood quickly and previously before that why he wasn't placed in the annals of history the way Geronimo and the others were. And it's because of his heritage. You see, Osceola was actually mixed. His father was white and his mother was mixed, black and Native American. And in the war, his closest allies and most of the men in his band, when he would do the guerrilla warfare, were black Seminoles. And he, of course, also had a black wife. Now, she wasn't his only wife, but he did have a black wife. And so the thing about it is that his mother, as I just mentioned, she was mixed, black and Native American. But in Native American culture, it's matrilineal, which means if your mother is your bloodline to Native Americans, that means you basically grow up in Native American culture. So he didn't grow up in the Florida Maroon culture or in the black Seminole villages, but he did grow up in Native American villages, and he grew up in Native American culture. Now, again, because of this heritage, we find that he is not given the credit in the overall annals of history. Even though in Florida he's very popular. There's an Osceola County. If you go to Tallahassee, his name is everywhere. And of course, Florida State, he's prominent at Florida State. Their mascot is called Chief Osceola. There's an Osceola Hall and all of those things that are named after him. But he is not given anywhere near the credit. And this again is something that we need to work on. And we need to recognize this man's contributions in American history. The fact that he also had a white name, which was Powell, indicated that he was recognized by whites during his time period, which was basically the early to mid 1800s. But the thing about it is, Osceola was not a man that they would want to place highly in the annals of history because of what he stood for. And he stood not just against the removal of Native Americans from their land to reservations, but he also represented the fight for freedom that his black counterparts were partaking upon. And he took that fight and made it part of his own fight as well. And so we need to re-examine and do much more work on Osceola, and we need to understand what Osceola went through in terms of him understanding his place as it results, or as it relates rather, to Native American society, black society, as well as white society. So remember that name, Osceola. Do a little research on him. He is someone that should be well known and recognized, just like Geronimo. I was recently asked about the separation or division between Seminole Native Americans and Black Seminoles. And so I want to give a quick historical overview of why that relationship and how that relationship deteriorated. It began during the Second Seminole War. And during the war, the Black Seminoles and those recent runaways who joined the fight were given an opportunity to ensure their freedom if they simply relocated out west to the Arkansas Territory. And so many of the Black Seminoles quit fighting. And so many of the Seminole Native American counterparts were upset with the Black Seminoles because they stopped fighting. But they made it clear to them that freedom was their primary objective, and that they would work with, hand in hand, Native Americans to try to ensure that they keep their land. But make no mistake about it, freedom was their top priority. And so there's the discussion also about Osceola himself, the primary war chief during the Second Seminole War, having some negative things to say about Black Seminoles. Although Osceola was mixed himself, his mother was half black and half Native American. Now, I have yet to see this information, but I'm not disputing other researchers and people who have put forth this information. I can simply deduce that when Osceola was taken and he was captured under a truce and he was removed from Florida, he was simply garnering information that was passed to him by other Native Americans who were going to the fort in which he was being held, but also through U.S. military personnel. And so he very well may have been upset as well, because he knew that the Black Seminoles were the best fighters. Even the U.S. military said that the Black Seminoles were the best fighters. So he knew that the Native Americans and their fight for land was directly tied to black Seminoles in their fight for freedom. And so when they stopped their fight, then he must have known also that this would be quite detrimental to the Seminole Native Americans' fight for land. Because you have to understand, even though Osceola was mixed, he grew up in Native American culture. And so I would only say to that also that we have to check that source in which we have that claims that Osceola made these statements, because if it's the U.S. military or a U.S. Florida Territory paper that printed this statement or put this quote out, or these negative words out per se, then we may have to take that with a grain of salt. That may have been a tactic to further divide the Native Americans and the blacks. Now, that was again the first major division, or major thing that happened rather, that caused that division. Once they moved out west, the dynamics of the relationship changed. And they were in the Arkansas Territory, and then they moved further west into the Arkansas Territory, which is now present-day Oklahoma. Now, the thing about it is, when they were in Florida, they had a relationship where there were three fields. There was a field or crops that were done by Native Americans. There was a field or crops that were done by the black Seminoles and Florida Maroons. And then there was a third field in which they worked together, but the proceeds went to the Native Americans. And this was for protection, as well as them being able to trade for things that they needed for both communities. Now, when they got out west, however, there were certain Native Americans who expected blacks to continue with the same relationship in creating this third tribute field. And so the black Seminoles questioned that, and they said, why would we continue to do a tribute field? We're all free, we all have this land, and there's no need for us to pay tribute, especially when we fought just as hard to get out here as you. And so that was the second major issue that started the rift between the Native Americans and the blacks within the Seminole Nation. Now, as time goes on again, when land allotments started coming from the U.S. government and the Seminole land started expanding, we had unscrupulous white Americans who would pay $5 just to get on the Indian rolls so that they could be a part of those land allotments. And so there's a term coined for those people, and they're called $5 Indians. And so what we notice is that when the whites who got onto the roll and started getting this land, they also began to enter into the Seminole Nation and into the Seminoles, how they were living, parts of their culture and things of that nature. And they began to also drive a wedge between the blacks and the Native Americans. They brought more of those negative attitudes against blacks into the Seminole Nation. And those negative attitudes continued to grow. So that became the third primary issue that happened within the Seminole Nation. Now, there were other small things that happened as well, but these were the three primary issues that caused this major rift between blacks and Native Americans in the Seminole Nation. And that rift just continued. And as blacks continued to get more and more of a negative concept, or a negative connotation rather, from whites, Seminole Native Americans began to adapt those negative connotations as well. And it further divided the two. And so that's basically the issue that we see in this rift between Native Americans and blacks within the Seminole Nation. I want to take a few minutes to touch on a subject that has been gaining more and more popularity, and that is the overwhelming evidence that we are uncovering and we are putting together with past evidence that undeniably proves that blacks were here in America long before Europeans. Now, we all know the most outward piece of information that was given was Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus. But also, more and more evidence is becoming clear that there were indigenous melanated people in the Americas. And what we are understanding is that history was erased, and that history has been denied to us because it's not serving an overall purpose. Now, the evidence that we have is in a couple of different things. The first is probably the Spanish. When they arrive in the Caribbean, they describe some of the natives as swarthy. And that word swarthy, we knew and know rather, is synonymous with dark-skinned. Now, another piece of evidence is still with the Spanish. When the Spanish created their first settlement in Gueldape, which is present-day Sapelo Sound, Georgia, the Wale natives, to which we are now looking at and examining whether or not they were the Native Americans that we think of today, or they were indigenous melanated people. What we do know is that when the Wale attacked the settlement of Gueldape, and they attacked from the outside, those who were enslaved inside the settlement began to set fires. So that in itself gives a good indication that there was some relationship between those who were enslaved and those who were part of the Wale. Now, the issue then becomes whether or not these people who were enslaved were all Africans, or were they dark-skinned people who belonged to the Wale. But a synchronized attack occurred, and we know this to be true. So there had to be some relationship, whether it was a relationship between Africans and these indigenous people, or these were indigenous black people, or even a mixture. But the fact remains that that synchronized attack does indicate. So we are doing more research on that particular event under those ideas of who were those enslaved people at Gueldape and their relationship with the Wale who attacked. And then there's other evidence that we have in United States Bureau of Indian Affairs papers in which they are describing indigenous people, and they're describing different things that relate to dark-skinned and the ideas that these dark-skinned people were indeed indigenous. And so when we began to thoroughly put all of those pieces, starting with Van Sertima and the work that was done out west in California, Mexico, Central America, South America, those earlier studies, and then we look at the early Spanish records in the Caribbean and on the East Coast, we can begin to put a strong picture and a strong argument. And then there's, of course, those people today, those melanated people today, who know that their heritage does not go to Africa, but indeed here as indigenous people. And so we will continue to do that research, and we will provide solid evidence. We're going to take just a minute to talk about indigenous blacks in America and their relationship to Africa and Africans. What we understand is that there were two lands. There was an Atwana land and a Gondwana land. And through whatever major catastrophe you would like to call it, Christians say that there was the Great Flood. Scientists always talk about the tectonic plates shifting and the melting of the Ice Age. Whatever the case may be, the land was broken up, and that can easily be seen. You can see how South America and the continent of Africa could have been one land mass easily. Now, when this happens, there are indigenous melanated people in the Americas. We know that the Olmecs predate the Aztecs. So there were undeniably melanated people, whether you want to call them black, whatever you like to call them, but melanated indigenous people existed in America, and in the Americas rather, long before whites. Also, when we're talking about the relationship between those indigenous melanated people and Africa, we understand that there continued to be a relationship for thousands of years. Africans knew that there were melanated people on the other side of the ocean. They would communicate with them through travel. They would trade. They would go to America. We see indigenous African cultural, material culture in the Americas years before Europeans. There also is the fact that there is a waterway in which Africans refer to as Little River. The currents on the west coast of Africa go southward. From central West Africa, they go westward. When those two currents meet, they create another current to which Africans referred to as Little River. This was one of the primary routes that they took from Africa to the America years before Europeans. Christopher Columbus, in his own writings, in his attempts to get people to support his idea and his voyage, told people that he got information from African seafarers. The same route that Columbus took to get to the Americas was a route that Africans had been using for hundreds of years before any European ever placed a boat in that water route. So we have undeniable proof. And as more researchers put this thing together, I'm hoping that we will do an anthology piece to undeniably demonstrate the existence of indigenous, melanated, or black people in this hemisphere. I've always wanted to do a balance between academia and the public, and it was always important to me to get that information out to the people. And so I've worked at museums, I've worked at archives, I've worked with community centers, I've worked with community development centers and other nonprofits like museums and libraries and archives that I mentioned earlier. And I do this because we need that information in the public where it can do the most good, where we educate our young people through after school programs. We also create exhibits. We also do various things with these different entities in order to elevate, educate, and empower our community. I've held different positions such as commissioner for the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, which is the only African American corridor in the National Park Service system. It is, again, the only heritage corridor dedicated to African Americans and their culture, and specifically the Gullah culture, to which my last year I served as the chair. I continue to this day working with various museums, libraries, getting their archives together so that they can create a better space for more research. I also write grants for various nonprofit entities such that we can continue to do this programming and provide the information that the public school system simply is not doing for our young black children and our young black people who want to educate themselves more about themselves and their culture. So today, currently, I own, I own a archival and historical research company called Archival and Historical Research Associates, in which I do all of these things, which includes a publication division. In that publication division, I have written 3 books. My first book is Up From Incarceration. If you recall, I said after a few years, I returned to Florida A&M. Well, during that time, I was caught up in this lure of fast money And it caught up with me such that I ended up dealing and having to go through incarceration. And so I wrote this book for anyone whose family member, young people particularly, who are going through a rough stage, getting into trouble, and just telling the truth about this ideology or these things dealing with the quote unquote thug life. And I'm destroying and debunking those myths that we have created about the thug life. Again, this one is up from incarceration. I also wrote a timeline of the African diaspora experience in Florida. This is a complete timeline history of African Americans in the state of Florida. This once was part of the Florida public education system, but it has now been removed. Therefore, we are making a concerted effort to get it into the public's hand, because that book should be in every black household in Florida. And then I have my book, Florida's Negro War, which was based on my dissertation research, which was looking at the black Seminoles and their leadership and involvement during the Second Seminole War. And so this public history book, Florida's Negro War, examines the Second Seminole War and tells the truth about it, that even the general of the U.S. military who was over it says this was not an Indian war. This is a Negro war. It is a story of unity and empowerment and what we can do if we just stick together. And I'm fortunate that this book is now being turned into a full project in which a documentary on the Black Seminoles is being created, as well as a full feature-length film based on the book. Again, my name is Dr. Anthony Dixon. God bless. One love.